Hello and welcome everyone to this workshop on human capital exploring skills in education. This is jointly sponsored by the ONS, ESCoE and the ESRC. I guess I don't have to convince anyone in this audience that human capital matters. And I think we've gone a long way in terms of understanding human capital, how it impacts on productivity, on prosperity, and its key role in reducing inequalities. If I go back, I've been working on human capital for longer than I care to admit. And I go back to my earlier work, we were very constrained in those days by data. So we could only look at qualifications. And it was tricky enough to even try to put together data sets on qualifications over time and comparing across countries. As we progressed over time, we have had access to a lot more new sources of data, thanks to the work of ONS, but also of other organizations that have been merging and continue to merge various data sets. And as we have more access to these new data, we have been able to answer much more interesting and much more complex questions. So the purpose of today's workshop is to examine what we've learned so far, but also crucially to think about what we need to know and how we could measure the data that will enable us to answer the questions that we would like to answer. So we have three main sessions. We have a session on skill mismatch, and this is an important area of analysis. It does focus quite a lot on the traditional qualification data, but it's an important issue of in particular at the graduate level, and the fact that we often see graduates doing non-graduate jobs. So there's some important issues in the three papers there. Then we go on to a session on using alternative sources of data. This is really an area which has been blossoming and accelerating. The number of people who are using these alternative sources of data, particularly the job vacancy data, has really mushroomed over time. And so we have some papers looking at alternative sources of data. The third session, and I think to my mind, one of the most crucial questions that we need to answer, but maybe that's because I'm working currently in this area, is the whole question of regional human capital, and to what extent that impacts on the levelling up agenda and the inequalities, particularly in the UK, that we observe across regions. And I guess my own view on this is that human capital is really crucial in explaining these differences and explaining why firms seem to locate, in this country at least, in one particular area and don't move to other parts of the country. And I think we have a couple of papers that will start at least exploring some of that issues there. It's very difficult to show that human capital is really the crucial barrier here, but as we go forward in this research, we'd hope that we'd be able to at least start a debate on this issue, if not come to conclusions very, very soon. And then the final session is a panel session, and we want to hear the panelists are asked to look for, to think about skills measurement again, and what kind of measures they would, what would be their wish list in terms of what kind of measures of human capital that they would want for policy analysis. Okay, so after this brief introduction, I think I'll turn over to Khloe Tabor, who is sharing the first session. And enjoy the day. I think we have some really great presentations. Please do participate, ask questions, and hopefully at the end of this day we'll be a lot further on in terms of our knowledge of what we know and what we don't know and what we'd like to know. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Mary said, I'm going to be chairing the first session. So we've got three really brilliant presentations to come. Each presenter is going to have 20 minutes, and then there will be 10 minutes for us to have a discussion and for you to ask any questions. So I would encourage you all to pop your questions in the Q&A chat as the presentation continues, and we can then unmute you and touch on those during the 10-minute discussion. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first presenter, Michela Vecchi from the University of Middlesex, who will present on occupational changes and skills mismatch during the COVID-19 pandemic. So over to you, Michela.
Okay. Thank you very much for your introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining the workshop. So the topic of this workshop is skill mismatch and occupational changes during the COVID-19. And the work that Kate Robinson and myself had been undertaken was funded by the ESRC. And this project uses data held by the Office for National Statistics, so the usual disclaimer applies. We would also like to acknowledge the assistance of colleagues at the ONS and BASE, for example, Marina Romiti, Maya Savic, and Sumit Chaduri, and Vecchi Agni, and they all provide invaluable support and advice on this project. So the overall aim of the project is to look at the labor market outcomes for graduates, and particularly to look at occupational shifts, skill mismatch, and training in time of recession. Occupational shifts we thought would be very interesting to look at during the pandemic due to the fact that several businesses closed down. Individuals had to retrain, so we heard stories of pilots retraining and going and work in the health sector. And we wanted to know to what extent these occupational shifts took place. And occupational shifts are also quite an underdeveloped topic of research in economics. But we think it's important to know more about it because the ability of changing occupation is very important to face crisis and to also improve your job opportunities. And occupational changes might have affected the skill mismatch. This is generally defined as the gap between worker skills and the skills required on the market. On this topic, there is a vast literature, and I will briefly touch on this later on. But we really didn't know what the effect of the pandemic was on the skill mismatch in the UK. And training can play an important job during a recession because it can support workers who lose their jobs to find a new occupation. And so the last part of the project wants to investigate how training might have facilitated the match between skill supply and demand during COVID-19. But the main focus of this presentation will be on the skill mismatch because of a time constraint, of course. And we focus on graduates because, as Mary said, that they are an important part of the labor force, and they are an increasing proportion of the labor force. They also represent the most skilled workers, and skills are crucial in driving economic growth and prosperity. In terms of the skill mismatch, we know that the skill mismatch is higher for graduates compared to non-graduates. And this poses some important questions in terms of returns to the education for the individuals, but also what the impact might be on productivity, given that the skill mismatch is generally associated with lower productivity performance. Just to give you an overview of the situation of the labor market in the UK, more or less when we started our project, this figure shows you the unemployment rates. The blue line represents the official unemployment rate published by the ONS, so therefore the whole labor force. The orange line is the unemployment rates for graduates. And as we can see, this follow closely the movement of the overall unemployment rate, although it's always below the overall figures. The line in gray represents the unemployment rate for recent graduates. And this clearly shows that recent graduates, which are defined as those graduates who graduated within the past 5 years, they've been more badly affected. And actually their unemployment rate starts to increase before the COVID crisis in 2018 Q3. And then it starts to decline in 2020 Q4. Now this stops in 2020 Q4, but we know from the news and from the official publication that likely the trends in unemployment are still on a declining trend. So these unemployment rates for both graduates overall and for recent graduates are much lower now compared to approximately a year ago. Then I would like also to mention briefly one of the main results related to occupational changes. So these figures in this figure we follow workers over 2 consecutive quarters. And of those who are in employment over those 2 quarters, we look at the proportion of those who changed occupation. And we compare the situation before the pandemic and during the pandemic in the last couple of bars. And the blue bars represent the proportion of people who change occupation overall, and the golden bar refers to graduates. As expected, graduates are more mobile than the overall figures because, as the literature discusses frequently, graduate workers are endowed with a vast variety of skills and they can adapt to different types of occupations. And there is, however, an exception to this trend. And between Q2 and Q3 of 2020, the proportion of graduates who changed occupation is lower than the proportion than the overall figure. So there is the lower proportion of graduates changing occupations in the midst of the pandemic. And we believe this is possibly explained by the fact that graduate jobs could more easily move to remote working. We've done a lot more work on this topic that I don't have time to discuss here, but the main results are published on the ONS website, and the link to our publication can be found on the title of this slide. Next, I'm going to move on to the skill mismatch. There is a vast literature on the skill mismatch, and the literature consistently shows that the skill mismatch is higher for graduates compared to non-graduates, and there is a wage penalty attached to the mismatch. This means that if a graduate has a level of skills which is above the one required for a particular occupation, he will earn less than a similar graduate who has found a graduate job. Although there is consistency of the results on the general extent of the skill mismatch and on its impact on wages, there are different views of what may happen to the skill mismatch during recessions. There is a possibility that during the recession, we observe a distraction of low quality jobs, which might lead to a decline of the skill mismatch. And firms during recession could also decide to upskill their labor force, taking advantage of perhaps an increasing supply of unemployed skilled workers on the market. And this also would lead to a decline of the mismatch in bad times. But it's also true that during recessions, there are fewer vacancies, fewer jobs opportunities. And this might lead a graduate worker to take on a job that does not require a degree for the purpose of avoiding unemployment. And therefore, the mismatch could increase. There's also evidence of increasing mismatch in bad time in a recent work by Liu et al. Published in 2016 in the European Economic Review. And they focus very much on the importance of initial labor market conditions for graduates. And they conclude that these initial labor market conditions have a persistent effect on the skill mismatch and on wages. And indeed, the quality of the match drives the wage differentials between graduates who graduate during recession and those who graduate outside a recession period. And I will refer back to this publication because we rely on their methods to construct an additional measure for the skill mismatch. So talking about measures, so we use two measures to evaluate the skill mismatch during this period. The first is a very standard measure, and it's the method followed by the Office for National Statistics, and is also being used in a vast number of publications. This measure, first of all, constructs a benchmark where each graduate's qualification is compared to this benchmark. And the benchmark is the average level of qualification within an occupation. And the occupation is defined as the 3-digit SOC classification. So a person is mismatched, the worker is mismatched if the skills, the qualification does not correspond to the average qualification in the occupation. And normally we distinguish between overqualification when the level of qualification of the worker is above the benchmark. And we talk of underqualification or undereducation when the qualification of the worker is below that benchmark. When the analysis focuses on graduates, by definition, they are never underqualified. So they are either matched or overqualified. And the skill mismatch, therefore, in this talk, mainly identifies graduates who is employed in a non-graduate occupation or in non-graduate jobs. And our first task was to extend this measure, first of all, to cover the most recent period, to cover the COVID-19 crisis. And normally this measure is constructed for first graduates, so workers with a first degree. But we wanted to extend it to the inclusion of postgraduates. This to address two questions. First of all, in previous presentation, we were asked what happens if we include postgraduates. And so we wanted to address these questions. And secondly, our second measure for the skill mismatch requires a large amount of information, large amount of data, and including postgraduates allowed us to work with a larger sample. And this is our first figure on the extent of the mismatch that covers the period before, from 2017 Q1 to 2020 Q4. The blue bars are the original mismatch measure, which only includes first graduates, and in the orange line represent the adjustment when postgraduates are included in the computation. The mismatch has declined over time. The decline is more visible on the blue line when we look only at first graduates. And from the highest point was in 2017 Q3. And it starts to really mainly decline from 2018 Q3. And the decline carries on during the pandemic. So in 2020 Q4, 25% of graduates were not working in graduate occupations, compared to 33% in previous years. When we include postgraduates, the extent of the skill mismatch is higher, is about 10% higher. But the trend over time is pretty similar. The reason that is higher is, well, we can find in economic reasons, because graduates might choose to study at the postgraduate level to specialize on a particular topic, but they are not, even though it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to get an occupation or a job that's on average requires a master's degree. There is also, a statistical issue here. Our benchmark doesn't change when we look at postgraduate. So we increase the number of people with higher qualification. Therefore, we do expect an increase in the mismatch. This measure, as I said before, has been widely used in related studies, but it's also been subject of several criticism. And one of the main criticisms is that education does not fully account for the skills of graduates. This measure is based mainly just on education. And with the increasing heterogeneity in the skills of graduates, we kind of put everything in the same box, and we cannot distinguish between different types of skills of both observable and unobservable nature. This measure also does not accurately account for the increase in the supply of degree subjects over time. So there are some occupations like nurses that did not require a degree until 2017, and that will affect the benchmark, so the overall average education in a particular occupation, and therefore will have an impact on the skill mismatch. Therefore, we thought it was important to explore and to test different methodology for accounting, for measuring the skill mismatch. And here we adopt a methodology that, as I said before, discussed in Liu et al. 2016, where a graduate worker is mismatched if he or she is employed in an industry that pays a lower premium for his or her qualifications. So we are not going to look at the mismatch within occupation, but we are going to refer to the wage levels within each industry to define the mismatch. And as part of this methodology, first of all, we need to derive wage premium within each industry for each year and for different types of degree. And this is done by running a regression where the logarithmic of hourly pay is regressed on dummies representing the different field of studies, and we include 17 fields of studies, full-time dummies, and control for regions. Then the estimates, this omega parameter here, provides the estimates of the wage premium, and the different premia are ranked in each year within each industry. And this ranking gives us the quality of the worker industry match. And following this publication, the contribution by Liu et al., a graduate worker with a degree F is mismatched if he or she is employed in an industry that pays the three lowest wage premium. To construct this measure, we use the annual population survey from 2017 to 2020. And then we adapt, once we derive the estimates of the wage premium, we can merge information with the quarterly LFS to get a more granular movement of this mismatch over time. There is an advantage. There are, of course, some limitations. I'm not going to speak too much about this here, but the main advantage of this measure is that it puts skills at the core of the construction of the skill mismatch indicator. So it's reasonable to assume that more skilled workers earn higher wages. And by taking into account wages to construct the mismatch indicator, we, in a way, account for different types of skills as well. And it's also important to take into account different fields of studies, because naturally the wage and the mismatch can change according to the different field of study. So this adds an additional dimension to the analysis of the skill mismatch. In addition to that, we have a near unique opportunities to compare the performance of the two mismatch indicators using the same data set. So it's an important robustness test. As I said before, to construct this second measure of mismatch, which we call industry rank measure, we have 17 degree subject and we look at 7 industries, which are listed on this slide. And one interesting thing to look at, to have a brief look at, is the average premium and how it changes over time. Now, we've got this picture for the 17 degrees. I'm going to show you these two just as an example. So these are on the first picture as graduates in physical and environmental science. The second figure is for business, finance, and admin graduates. And each line in the chart represents a different industry. I mean, these figures are a little bit busy, but the main message to take on is that 2 industries, which is distribution and hotels and other services, are at the bottom of this chart. And so and this is consistent across the different degrees. So no matter what degrees you have, if you work in these 2 industries, you are likely to be mismatched. While at the top, very often we find the finance sector. Again, independent of the degree, the finance industry is the ones that most years it pays the highest premium. And this is what the skill mismatch looks like. And here we compare the blue line, the original occupational measure of mismatch for graduates. The orange line is the occupational measure that includes postgraduates. And the gray line in the middle is the new skill mismatch measure. The 3 measures are fairly consistent. The exception is this jump of the industry ranking mismatch indicator in 2018. And this is the only year when this indicator goes above the occupational mismatch that includes postgraduates. And of course, we went to look at the data to understand what goes on. And the strong increase in this type of mismatch in 2018 is driven by an increase of mismatched graduates in the public sector. And the public sector is a sector where we often find a higher proportion of mismatched workers according to this measure. And indeed, in 2018, there was a decline in wages within the public sectors. And this probably has shifted a higher number of graduates in the mismatch categories. So this kind of explain this big jump here. But overall, in terms of trend, they are fairly similar across the 3 measures. And this is true when we look at overall trends. But in the next picture, we look at changes in the skill mismatch over 4 wide UK region. And so on the left, we have the occupational mismatch. On the right, the industry rank measure of mismatch. And the first thing to notice is that there is more variation over time in the industry rank measure, there are more fluctuations. And quite important things to notice is that England appears, so the ranking of the region changes when we use different types of mismatch. So in the occupational mismatch, England in most years is the region with the highest level of mismatch, while it's persistently at the lowest end of the spectrum when we look at the industry rank measure. And we think that probably the situation in London and generally the Southeast may drive both trends in these 2 graphs. In the occupational mismatch, we know that in London, there is a high, the hospitality sector employs a large number of workers, and there is a high proportion of mismatched workers in this industry. And very often this industry attracts graduates from EU countries. So that could explain why we find such a higher level of the mismatch in England. In terms of the industry rank measure, London and the southeast of England are also the region with the highest wages, and there is a high concentration of finance-related jobs in London. And so these, I think, has a big impact on our second measure of this match, of the mismatch. So the mismatch is lower because there are a lot of jobs in London in industry that pay a higher wage premium. And next, we want to understand, I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, I'm sure somebody will shout at me if I talk too much.
You have 2 minutes left, Michela,
2 minutes,
just to let
okay.
you know.
Thank you very much. So next, we wanted to have a look at how the mismatch impact on wages. As I said earlier on, the literature consistently estimates a wage penalty for mismatched workers. In this study, differently from what we've done in the past, we use panel data techniques by constructing a pseudo panel. So we are following not individuals, because the annual population survey is not a panel, does not have a panel dimension, but we follow workers with the same degree, working in the same industry, in the same region over time. And so we regress wages on the mismatch indicators, time dummies, regional dummies, field of study dummy, and other controls. And this is our main result. In the first column, we use the occupational mismatch measure. The results show that a graduate in a non-graduate occupation earns approximately 32% less compared to a graduate in a graduate occupation. And this is a result, this is the size, what is called in the literature, the size of the wage penalty. And this result is consistent with several publications using similar techniques. When we look at the industry rank mismatch measure, however, we find a much lower wage penalty. This is about 7.4%. And the result, the penalty further reduces if we use fixed effect estimators. So when we try to further account for unobservable factors. And we thought this result is very important because the size, I can now skip this, the size of the penalty is very often used as like a proxy of the impact of the skill mismatch on productivity. And the impact, as we can see on these slides, can be very different depending on which measure of mismatch we refer to. And so the two measures clearly capture different types of workers. And we kind of produce a cross tabulations of the two measures to have a look at which type of, to get an indication of what is the type of mismatch that we should really focus on. And what this table shows you is that 22% of graduates are mismatched according purely to the occupational method. So there are graduates in non-graduate jobs in industry that pays the highest premium. 21% of all graduates work in a graduate job, but they are working in industries that pays the lowest premium. So difficult to know which of these two we should really focus, because graduates are mismatched according to different types of criteria. But the most problematic group that we believe is important to focus for further discussion, further analysis, is the last group. In the last row here, the last row presents the proportion of graduates who are mismatched under both indicators. So they don't work in a graduate job, and and they work in industries that pay the lowest premium. So they are really the ones that suffer most the consequences of the skill mismatch. So quickly through some summaries. So as we saw at the beginning, labor market outcomes for graduates have worsened during the pandemic, perhaps not as much as we expected, and certainly graduates seems to be doing better than non-graduates. They've got lower unemployment rates, and perhaps again, unexpectedly, we found a decline in the skill mismatch. They started in 2018 and carries on during the pandemic. Why is the skill mismatch declining? A possible reason we thought was perhaps more graduates are becoming unemployed. However, we did some analysis on this and we could not find any evidence. Possibly graduate jobs are more suitable for online working. And so one reason for the decline is that graduates find that to move occupation perhaps, but they find it easier to get a new job. Businesses might have taken advantage of the recession to upskill the labor force. But another possible factor that might have contributed to the decline of the skill mismatch is that there is a decline in the influx of foreign graduates. And in some of our previous studies, we show that a big proportion, a substantial proportion of the mismatch is explained by graduates from foreign institutions, so migrants, immigrants who graduated abroad. And this
Sorry, Michela, are you able to wrap up? We've got a couple of questions and I'm conscious we're eating into
I've really finished. This was my last point, and then I was going to talk about future development. So we are looking further analyzing the relationship between training and skill mismatch. We are also adding an additional measure of mismatch that looks at the mismatch between the degrees of the graduates and the degree that is more common within occupations. And at the moment, we've only constructed this for 2017, but we are carrying on. We also want to look more closely at the issue of nationality and extend the analysis to the financial crisis, so we can compare the situation of the skill mismatch in two different critical periods. And in the plan, there is also the investigation of the relationship between skill mismatch and productivity using industry-level productivity estimates, and possibly also include measure of life satisfaction for skill mismatch workers to better understand the consequences of the mismatch on the individuals. Sorry if I've gone a little bit over time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Michela. That was a really interesting presentation, and we do have a number of questions. So I think the first one we've got is from Yanis Galanikas.
Okay, do you think the declining mismatch and the greater mobility of all during the pandemic came from the great resignation? I don't know, it could be. I mean, there are different factors that may have affected the mismatch, and this could be a possible explanation. And Kate Robinson, my co-author, is in the audience. So Kate, you're welcome to join in if you have further comments on any of the questions. And then Yuan, Michela, do you think that there is a role in the tertiary education sector to provide more of a broad degree teaching style, perhaps akin to the United States Scottish university system, given the prevalence of this skill mismatch? I think that a broad degree teaching, broad qualification can be very important, not only to reduce the skill mismatch, but also to face the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. There is a lot of uncertainties of how the job market is going to change in the near future. And certainly having broad degrees can help in finding different jobs in the future. Any reason why 2018 seems to be a turning point rather than 2020 COVID? possibly Brexit referendum impact. Yes, this is a comment by Sanjeev. We thought of that. So together with Brexit and COVID-19, this is likely to have reduced the influx of immigrants. And yes, as I mentioned towards the end, it is possible that Brexit has had an impact. It's difficult to kind of distinguish between COVID and Brexit because they happened more or less at the same time. But certainly the decline started before COVID, and Brexit could be a possibility.
I think you've put yourself on mute there, Michela.
Okay. Did you hear my previous comments?
We heard, yeah, your previous comments.
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize I just switched. Increasing intervention of technology in labor market that makes skills obsolete frequently. We have not looked at that yet, but another extension of this project, another topic we would like to work on is to look more at the impact of technology. Certainly, this is a very important move forward. Augustine, hi Augustine. Should you include recent entrants, non-graduates in figure 1? There are reports of low-skilled young being the first fired during the pandemic, early stages. Yes, indeed. I do have the figures for non-graduates, but they have not been cleared. So I cannot show, I couldn't put them on the slides. But certainly, yes, that figure needs to have a bit more details, to look at graduates, non-graduates, to report youth unemployment as well, to have a better picture of the situation on the labor market and how unemployment has behaved during this period.
Great, thank you very much, Michela. I think you covered all those questions really quickly as well, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Probably have time for just one more if anyone had any further questions. Mary, did you want to ask a question?
I was wondering about the in your regressions, the experience term. I don't know if you can go back, but so if you look at the say the industry measure, your coefficient is minus one back.
Sorry, this is the one. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah,
this one.
The coefficient on the occupational mismatch is 7.4%, but then you've got this experience.
Yes.
Would that say within a couple of years that the graduates don't see a wage penalty? Am I misinterpreting that?
No, this simply, the experience simply captured the effect of experience on wages. So wages increase with additional year of experience by about 3%. And this is consistent across both measures. And so this is not related to the skill mismatch. This is simply an additional control that we added. Because it's like a sort of a panel, we don't need to include many controls because a lot of factors are captured by the various dummies that we include. So we have year fixed effect, region fixed effect, subject and industry fixed effects. But we wanted to check whether, including some typical labor market factors that are typically included in a wage regression could somehow affect the results. Here I'm only.
I suppose.
What
What motivates my question is, we have very high mismatch, but to what extent, are people mismatched initially when they go in the labor market, but the mismatch changes because firms use those graduates in a different way than they use their non-graduates within the same. And I suppose you can't answer that question with this kind of data, but it seems to me that that's an interesting question to look at.
Yeah, no, indeed. We could have some interaction with the experience and mismatch. So to see whether increasing experience leads to perhaps a lower mismatch penalty. Ideally, we would like to look at different cohorts of graduates. And in fact, originally, this industry rank mismatch measure looks at graduates who graduate in the year before the recession. But unfortunately, we can't do that because of data limitation. We simply don't have enough information to follow different cohorts of graduates and to better address this question, Mary.
Okay.
Thanks both. And thanks very much, Michela. So we're now going to move on to our second presenter, Francesca Borgonovi from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. And they're going to discuss the measurement of 21st century skills in large-scale assessments and the opportunities and challenges for mapping the skills of today and tomorrow's workers. So over to you, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Khloe, and thanks everyone for the invitation. I'm not going to present necessarily work that I've conducted myself. The beauty of working at the OECD is that you work in large teams and there is so much that gets contributed by different parts from the house. Now, my role in the panel, I think, is to consider a little bit more in detail the role of 21st century skills, and in particular, go a little bit deeper into the measurement and mapping of what skills do youngsters get from initial education, but also what skills may be in need of being promoted through further education and training. And the measurement aspect, I think, is crucial in general, but not only. I mean, we have heard a presentation where we focused on issues related to qualifications and field of study, but even when you study the same program and obtain the same degree, some of the skills that you acquire in these programs may be widely different depending on your teachers, but also your peers and what people are putting in the classes. So I'll try to work a little bit on a general mapping of what the OECD as an organization, but in general, organizations that deal with the measurement of skills are doing at the moment. Now, why is it important to consider changes in the demand for skills? Well, technology is reshaping the demand for skills quite fast, and at the same time, workers are staying in their job for a long time. Globalization is also shaping, for example, migration patterns, and the skills that new workers may have may not necessarily be exactly mapping the skills that people, for example, with similar qualifications have developed in a country. Now, what does the OECD do? It does a lot of work in terms of mapping both skills demand, but also supply and the development of skills, whether in education or adult learning and adult training pathways. It is a forum where different countries share good examples, and it provides a forum for dialogue. So to try and see what are some of the, I would say, solutions that different countries are adopting, and some of the policies and interventions that are developed. Now, what we have observed is that labor market imbalances have increased in recent years, and then we can have a discussion of what recent years really mean in different countries. And in a sense, there is I would say, a general deterioration of the ability of countries to respond effectively to rapid changes in labor market needs, in a sense, because there is a lack of fit between what education systems, whether that's initial education, vocational education and training, or, for example, tertiary level institutions, and what is needed in labor markets, but also in in societies more widely. And at the same time, what we have observed is that across OECD countries, there is generally a rather low uptake of adult education. There is a bit more in terms of informal learning that occurs on the job, but there is generally very little participation in formal and non-formal education, and the quality of the training that adults get on the job is very varied. So in a country like Italy, almost 8 out of 10 workers are not participating in formal or non-formal learning opportunities, and the quality when they are doing so is widely different. So for some, even when they do participate, making sure that they develop skills that are needed in the labor market and are as a result well matched is a struggle. Now, in terms of how things have evolved in terms of skill imbalances, we are updating analysis on skill imbalances in the labor markets in OECD countries, but we have data from 2004 and 2014. And here I'm not talking about qualification imbalances or field of study imbalances, but rather looking at the specific skills that people bring on the job and what they are required to do on the job. And what this figure shows is that there has been, in a sense, an increase in imbalances. There is an increased shortage of skills, including things like communication skills, collaboration skills, problem-solving ability, and things like metacognitive abilities. And on the other side, there has been a decline in the need and therefore a surplus of things like static strength, manual dexterity, stamina, arm, hand steadiness, and this sort of manual skills that are required oftentimes in manual occupations. Now, this is an example of the skills that colleagues, including Maria Grazia Squiccerini, Lea Samek, and Emil Kamerat from the OECD, have examined as being needed in AI-related jobs in the United States. And they've done great work on this sort of analysis, mapping skill needs in a variety of sectors, but concentrating especially on AI-related occupations. And there are definitely, a number of technical skill bundles that very much focus on AI, either production or use. But there's also over here a set of skills that include what are generally referred to in the literature as 21st century skills. There's communication skills, problem-solving ability, creativity, teamwork, and collaboration. So even in the, I would say, most technical or very technical parts of the labor market, there is a requirement for 21st century skills, which are actually what you observe in the labor markets overall. And I would say that when at the OECD we mapped the framework documents that guide either at the national level or at the international level what happens in the education system, what are the skills, what are frameworks that define what sort of skills and competences do individual needs. there is I would say, an increasing emphasis on these 21st century skills. So just looking at the ACT, because it's here in the middle and it's written bigger, you have, again, this collaboration, communication. There is issues related to digital technology, but there is, again, issues related to problem solving. There are issues related to creativity. So I would say that there is an increasing recognition of the importance of 21st century competences in the education sector, at the very least in initial education and training, in initial education. To what extent these are then implemented in classrooms around the world, it's a different matter. Now, this is a summary of the range of competencies that were part of the previous frameworks, trying to map what is in common across the frameworks. And what we do see is that there is a cognitive skill bundle, things like, for example, text comprehension or numeracy. There is a dimension related to interpersonal skills, such as, for example, achievement motivation, a range of skills related to interpersonal relations and social skills, including, for example, goal-directed collaboration. There is an aspect related to metacognitive and self-regulatory skills, for example, perseverance and task persistence. And then there are skills related to civic and citizenship and digital and ICT proficiency. Now that we looked at what are the frameworks that are in a sense identified in documents in education systems to guide what happens on the ground, the issue is how can the acquisition of these skills be measured in a valid and reliable way? And the reason why measurement of these skills is important is that it allows education policymakers, but also people that, on the other hand, work in labor markets, to identify the distribution of skills, but also ultimately how these can be promoted, and if they are needed in the labor market and societies, make sure that the population has the skills that are needed, whether through initial education opportunities or in adult education and learning. Now, large-scale assessments are one way in which we can identify and map the distribution of skills and factors that can promote skills. They have been typically used for a very long time on issues related to, for example, literacy, numeracy, or scientific literacy. But they have opportunities to aid the mapping and assessment of 21st century skills, because to start with, they are able to collect knowledge and I would say expertise from a wide range of countries, and that guarantees, so to speak, the validity of assessments and framework constructs across a wide range of contexts that may differ in terms of linguistic or cultural background. And at the same time, they do provide at specified time points how the development of 21st century skills, and not only, is progressing and it's going. And that, I think, it's important whether to see well in advance if there may be mismatches later on, but also to plan, for example, for training, whether in firms or outside firms to correct some of the imbalances in the skills individuals possess, so that they are able to fulfill their duties, but also, and not just be productive, but also gain as a result. Now, what are some of the opportunities that are related to measuring skills? Well, it's definitely true that what counts should be measured, and so measuring 21st century skills should be incorporated in measurement frameworks as a way to better understand the supply of skills, but also what gets measured gets to count. And one of the big criticisms of influential large-scale assessments such as PISA has been in the past that the exact framework that assessments take, in a sense, directs instruction and it directs policy making. And there may be an element of truth in that, but I think one could also use the argument to say, well, if we improve assessments, maybe we can redirect, in a sense, instruction in a way that is more functional to what is needed down the line in the labor market and society. And finally, I think, in a sense, assessments are a way to promote policymaking in specific domains, and the issue of how to develop and how to tailor instruction to promote 21st century skills is one of the crucial issues in terms of how to organize education systems and training systems. Now, one of the three key challenges in terms of 21st century skills is that on one side we have what the demand requires, or what the labor market is asking. They're asking people who are creative. They're asking for people who can solve problems that they haven't encountered before, that can communicate well with others. But how do we actually measure the skills on the supply side, and how do we make sure that we understand how to distinguish between different levels of proficiency and how to promote them? Now, most 21st century skills so far have been measured using self-reports. As such, there are programs related to the awareness of individuals or others with respect to individuals in assigning different levels of proficiency. And so there has been a big effort in trying to develop cognitive tests and assessments on how 21st century skills can be measured. And one of the main reasons why there has been a big push in this direction is that a lot of assessments, tests and assessments have been shifted on computers. So computer-based delivery is these days the standard for many assessments, whether at the international or at the national level. And that allows for a number of features. Ex post, once you have administered standard cognitive tests, you can develop some behavioral indicators of how people are addressing or are answering to the test questions as a way to capture some of the 21st century skills that I just described. For example, task persistence, and I will make some examples of that.
You've got 2 minutes left, Francesca.
Okay,
just,
But then you can also look at ex ante what to do in terms of developing assessments that include simulation that allows for the measurement in a better way of the skills measured. Here, just to give you some examples of international large-scale assessments that have included measures of 21st century skills. And here are some examples of such skills. Behavioral indicators like task persistence, domain general problem solving, collaborative problem solving, creative thinking, and adaptive problem solving. Now, with Elodie and Drew, who will speak later on, we have looked at indicators of task persistence using PISA 2018 data, and task persistence is conceptualized in terms of the ability of test takers to maintain baseline levels of accuracy throughout a long 2-hour test delivered on a computer. Other assessments in PISA, there is a domain general problem solving assessment, and here is the definition of what this entails. But here you can see how a computer platform is used to see to what extent a test taker is actually adopting, in this case, a scientific approach to solving a problem and interacting with a system that they haven't encountered before by moving sliders in a way that is consistent with what is called voted strategies, vary one thing at a time. And here you can see that in terms of distribution of proficiency, there is, compared to the level of academic achievement in standard literacies like text comprehension or numeracy, in many OECD countries, problem-solving skills are lower than what would be expected. Here is an example of another of these skills, collaborative problem solving in the context of PISA 2015. Here are types of problems that children were presented with. And the interesting feature of this assessment was that although it's called collaborative problem solving, the computer delivery platform was used to actually get individual kids to interact with a computer agent as a way to standardize the assessments and control one part of the collaboration. And with questions, we can discuss what that entails. And finally, just creativity, very difficult to measure in practice. There is an entire research and development program at the OECD on how to measure creativity. And here are some examples of what people are asked to do in terms of, broad idea generation, like these two, and the generation of different ideas. So there is work that is going into how much different can you differentiate between different tasks. This is details for the innovative parts that look at how to build up, for example, the creativity assessment. And for those who are interested in labor markets, more specifically, and assessments of adults, the new PX cycle will have an assessment of interactive problem solving. And if anyone is interested, we can have a discussion about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. So we'll now open it up to any questions that anybody has. I can't see any in the chat box at the moment, but if you do have a question, please post them in there and then we can unmute you so you can ask your question. Mary, I can see you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in?
And this is a very kind of general question about the extent to which those providing education really buy into this need for these more creative skills. And I'm particularly thinking at the tertiary level. I can see that you've done quite a lot at the school level and through the PISA results. But working in this sector, the tertiary sector pays lip service to this kind of creativity, these kind of skills, but in actual fact, there's all these competing demands, particularly to do with the way we're evaluated through national student surveys, etc. And that that seems to put a brake on to the extent to which we as lecturers can actually bring in new material and get students to do things that they wouldn't have done before, you know, trying to stimulate their creativity. And I wonder to what extent the OECD have been kind of talking, I guess you have been talking to schools a lot, but have you been talking to further education or third level education and trying to get the message across about how crucial this is?
I mean, I think the very lengthy introduction, in a sense, was going in that direction. If you look at frameworks, and I have shown you the frameworks of, national levels or international organizations, with schools is much easier to do that than with tertiary education. Everyone is doing this in theory, and everyone is caring a lot about this in theory. We know that it's demanded by employers, and we know that it's increasingly needed in societies. But are they doing that in practice? I think very, very little. There are great examples of programs, for example, in the arts. There is an OECD report on practices used in arts education that really map very well with the underlying constructs that you identify in many of these 21st century skills and how teachers can incorporate these in classrooms beyond art education. But are they doing that? Not really. So I think the moment you have, in a sense, your education system evaluated more on the basis of these 21st century skills. If you had a PISA ranking on this basis, would that provide the momentum to get it more in classrooms? I don't know, but I think there is an element of once you show how in a sense, poorly some students are doing. And I showed some of examples on the domain general problem solving. They're not learning this in the classroom. They're learning science. That problem is really about how to apply the scientific method. It's really like, you run a little simulation, essentially. Can kids do this? No, they can't, oftentimes. I think there is an element of measurement to see how we stand, but also by showing how poorly we are doing, hopefully we can change the requirements and the incentives that the different actors have in promoting these skills.
Thanks, Francesca. We've got another question from Martin Christian Kent. So can we unmute Martin so we can ask their question?
I can read Martin's question. I mean, to what extent do you think the way in which the skills are identified reflect in what employers really mean when they talk about specific skill needs? Probably not everywhere. There are, employers in different contexts will need specific facets. But I do think that one of the, I would say, good things about these large-scale initiatives is really providing some conceptual clarity about, okay, we mean collaboration. What does it really mean in practice? There is an element of consensus building. There is an element of bringing different bits and pieces, all together. And there is an element of decision-making in large groups. What is it that you really need? And then employers, will probably need different pieces out of these big facets. But I do think that as important as the aspect of measurement levels of proficiency in different populations, it's equally important to have experts from a wide range of fields, including, cognitive psychology, development psychology, and psychometrics, and labor market experts in terms of what do we mean when we talk about collaboration. Then there can be other aspects that are additional, but that helps probably others reflect upon what is it that they mean when they talk about these very, very general constructs.
Sure. Thank you very much, Francesca. So there's one more hand raised, Michela, if you can ask your question very briefly, and we will then move on to the next presentation.
Okay, thank you, Francesca. That was a very interesting presentation. More than a question, is an observations, and you partly already answered what I wanted to ask you, whether there is indeed the need of more multidisciplinary evidence from psychology, from the arts industry, to see how to boost cognitive skills, which also include creativity. And in this respect, the British government has cut funding for arts education in the tertiary sector. So this doesn't really match with what you are telling us today, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I do think that in general, I didn't show one last slide because I was short of time. But the model in which we have, teachers as the sage on the stage, rather than the person that accompanies a personal journey of discovery, of working together, moving from behavioralism to constructivism. There are people that are very good at doing this that are not math teachers, for example. Equally, when we think about skills shortages, there are some crucial, psychology teaches us that, of course, you can, our brains are plastic, and you can learn new things at different times, but there are some crucial developmental moments in which it's really good to learn about how to collaborate with others. Probably not as much as we know about, text comprehension skills or the acquisition of, specific math concepts. But, and that's maybe a criticism of psychology, maybe there could be a greater investment from the developmental side on when is it that it's really good to get these things. As our lives are getting longer, we may want to invest our time when it's actually really needed in learning specific skill set, and then leave for later what we can keep on updating over time because the needs are changing as technology changes. And Khloe wants me to shut up.
No, it's really, really interesting debate. Thank you. It's really interesting, but I'm conscious of time. So I will move on to the final presenter. So we have Stephan Bischof from the Leibniz Institute of Educational Trajectories, whose talk is called Measuring Skill Mismatch in the German National Educational Panel Study. So over to you, Stephan. You're on mute, Stephan. Do you unmute yourself, please?
So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Great, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the welcoming words. And I'm very happy today to present at the Human Capital Workshop about the measuring of skill mismatch in the German National Educational Panel Study, NEPS. First of all, I want to give you a brief overview of my talk today. First of all, I will give you some basic information about the NEPS and the framework for measuring skill mismatch in the NEPS. And as a second step, I want to give you some insights in very recent developments of the skill mismatch measurement in the NEPS. And I want to conclude with some central aspects for measuring skill mismatch. Yeah, first of all, some basic information on the German National Educational Panel Study, NEPS. The NEPS is a panel survey carried out by the Leibniz Institute for Educational Trajectories since 2009. And what is really important, the NEPS consists on a multi-cohort sequence design with a total number of more than 60,000 target persons from 6 different cohorts. And for each of these cohorts, we have annual measurements since 2009. And for each of these 6 cohorts, the NEPS collects longitudinal data on the development of competencies, educational processes, educational decisions, and returns to education. in formal, non-formal, and informal contexts, and also important throughout the lifespan. But yeah, for measuring skill mismatches, since measuring skill mismatches or skill mismatches occur in the labor market, so for target persons for relevance for measuring skill mismatch are only those individuals in gainful employment. Yeah, as a next step, I want to give you insights in the framework or the central framework for measuring skill mismatch in the NEPS. And this framework consists of three essential aspects. The first aspect is that we cover both objective skill mismatches and subjective measures. Objective measures, as said also in the previous presentation, are typically based on competency tests or cognitive tests, whereas subjective skill mismatches are based on self-reports of the respondents. The second essential aspect of our measurement is that we cover skill-specific mismatches and also global mismatches. Global mismatch means an overall fit or misfit between individuals and their job. And skill-specific skill mismatches focus not on the overall fit, but on mismatches in several specific skill domains. So, for example, a skill mismatch in mathematics or in reading. And the third central aspect of our measurement framework in the NEPS is that we use a panel design. So we measure skills and skill mismatch over the lifetime. And this is really important because skill mismatch is a dynamic phenomenon. And this dynamic phenomenon requires a life course perspective because skill mismatches appear and disappear as both, or might disappear as both jobs and people change over time. Let me start with the opportunities to measure objective skill mismatch in the NEPS. So as we also heard in the first presentation today, the operationalization of objective skill mismatch is typically based or typically you need information on people's level of skills and the level of skills required on people's jobs. And the basic principle for the operationalization of objective skill mismatch is a comparison between people's level of skills and the level of skills required in people's occupational groups. And for example, as also mentioned in a former presentation, there's for example the statistical method of realized matches that you can apply to operationalize objective skill mismatches. And the NEPS adult cohort here as an example provides rich information for the operationalization of objective skill mismatch, because we have information on people's competencies in 5 different skill domains that are relevant for the labor market success. So based on based on the NEPS data, you can operationalize skill mismatches in 5 different skill domains. And here on this slide, I bring you some descriptive findings for the NEPS adult cohort for the incidence of objective skill mismatch in the 5 skill domains. As we can see here in the bars in magenta are those individuals who are underskilled, and the light blue are matched, and the dark purple color are those who are overskilled. As we can see here, that for the 5 different skill domains, we have very similar results. And this is also due to the method of operationalization, due to the statistical approach. And we see here that we have approximately equal shares of underskilled and overskilled per skill domain. What is also important here is that we can distinguish underskilled, matched, and overskilled in the objective skill mismatch measure. Yeah, as a next step, I want to give you some insights on the subjective skill mismatch measure of the NEPS. Here, it is really important that this, what I show you on this slide and on the next slide, is the current status of measuring subjective skill mismatch in the NEPS. but we want to revise it, but I will come to this later in the presentation. The current status of measuring subjective skill mismatch in the NEPS, we use one global measure, and we have annual measurements for this global measure. Here you can see the current measure of global skill mismatch, and here the respondents are required to answer to the formulation. The requirements of the job match my skills. And these are, what you can see here are findings from NEPS adult cohort 2019 wave. And we can see here on the right side, on the right box, the bars in dark red and the bar in dark turquoise. We can see that are those people who rather agree or completely agree. And this is around 80%. And yeah, we can define them as matched. So 18% of the respondents assess themselves to be matched, whereas at 20%, the three bars on the left side, we can define as mismatch because they do completely disagree or rather disagree or partly agree with the statement. But what becomes obvious when we look in more detail to those who are mismatched, that this measure, the current measure of global skill mismatch, does not provide us any information on whether the mismatched people are underskilled or overskilled. So this measure, the current measure, does not give us any information whether those who are mismatched are underskilled or overskilled. And this brings me to one of the central limitations of the current subjective measures, or the current subjective measure of skill mismatch in NEPS, that we don't have the opportunity to distinguish between underskilling and overskilling. And this is a clear need for revision to offer a more differentiated scaling for subjective measures, where a distinction between underskilling and overskilling is possible. And another limitation we want to target is due to the objective measures. Up to now, we only merely use objective measures, cognitive measures, such as like reading literacy, mathematics, ICT, but we do not cover so far skills. As we heard in the former presentation, skills relevant in 21st century skills, like for example teamwork, communication. We do not cover them so far. So I come to the very recent developments in the skill mismatch measurement of the NEPS, and our main aim was to tackle these limitations. And now, we developed, due to these reasons, new and refined measures for subjective skill mismatches. And there we want to use a new or very refined global measure. And we also want to use several skill-specific measures. This is a pre-selection so far of 10 skill-specific domains that are really relevant for a 21st century labor market. And also skill domains that are not testable in objective testing, cognitive tests. So like, for example, teamwork skills or external communication skills. So we want to cover this by subjective skill mismatch measures. Before I show you the first results and insights for these new measures, I present you what the new items look like. And here you can see the example for the new subjective measure of skill mismatch, the global measure. And as you can see here in the answer categories, we use a 5-point scale. And this newly refined 5-point scale allows us a differentiation between underskilled, matched, and overskilled. because the first two categories, 1 and 2, belongs to underskilling, and 4 and 5 because belongs to overskilling. So we can differentiate the underskilled from the overskilled and from the matched. And here I have an example for one of the new skill-specific measures. In this case, it is the teamwork subjective skill mismatch measure. And yeah, as you can see here, compared to the former slide, compared to the global measure, the formulation of the question is in the skill-specific measures almost identical to that of the global measurement. But we have here one additional important aspect for all skill-specific measures, that we use an additional category, what you can see, skills not required, because this is necessary for skill-specific measures, because some skills are not used and not required in specific occupations. For example, in this case of teamwork, an individual working without teammates does not need teamwork skills, or teamwork skills are not required in their job. So we also have to offer an additional category to select for those who cannot make use of the skills in their jobs. Before these newly developed measures can be used in the regular NEPS studies, they undergo, or they had to undergo, certain quality tests. And two important quality tests we carried out, or still carrying out, is cognitive pre-testing and pilot study. In 2020, last year, for 2 years, we carried out a cognitive pre-test on a small number of people. And there we had mainly a qualitative focus. We asked the respondents, what do they understand when reading the mismatch items, and if they have any difficulties in answering the question and difficulties in understanding, and what specific activities they are thought of in the individual skills. And all in all, we had a positive evaluation of the refined global measure and the new skill-specific measures. So the cognitive pre-tests were very well. And 1 week ago, we had our pilot study, or we carried out a pilot study on a higher number of people. And there the focus is more quantitative. So here we want to see, do we have reasonable descriptive findings for the new measures? And for example, are the bivariate correlations reasonable? Do they fit to theoretical assumptions? And I'm very happy that I can present today some very first results of the pilot study. And here, I show you the results for the global skill mismatch measure and for the teamwork skill mismatch measure. And as we can see here, the bars in magenta and light blue are those who are underskilled. And here we assess themselves as underskilled. And as we can see here, these are from between 5 to 6% in both measures. And in the bar in dark purple, we can see those are the ones who assess themselves as matched. This is almost half of the respondents. And the bars in dark red and dark turquoise are those who assess themselves of being overskilled for their job. And those are around 40 to 50%. And what is interesting here, we see in the very first results somewhat similar results for the global measure and the teamwork measure. But at the moment, because these findings are very recently, we do not know if these are the same people who assess themselves as underskilled, for example, in the global measure and in the teamwork measure. What is also really interesting in these measures, or in the distribution of this measure, is when we compare this with the objective skill mismatch measures. And there we clearly observe significant differences when comparing these distributions with distributions of the objective measures. Because at the objective measures, we had around 15% underskilled, 15% overskilled. And here, we have significantly different patterns. However, this is important. This does not necessarily imply that these distributions of the subjective measures are implausible, because this is typically for subjective skill mismatch measurements. We also find such distribution patterns for subjective measures of other surveys. For example, for the European Skills and Jobs Survey, we also find significant higher amount of people who assess themselves as overskilled compared to underskilled. And these interpretations or these findings demonstrate once again the importance of measuring both subjective and objective skill mismatch.
Got just under 2 minutes left, Stephan.
Yes. I want to give you an outlook on the next steps, what we will do, or what we plan. First of all, our next step will be the evaluation of the pilot study. As I said, it's carried out 1 week ago. So we have to evaluate it, and then we have to do a final selection of the skill mismatch measures, of the new subjective skill mismatch measures. And as an outlook, we want to use them or do the first measurements in regular NEPS adult cohorts in the next year, in 2023. And prospectively, we want to do measurements of, we want to do use these measures in a 3-year cycle, not only for the adult cohort, but also for the younger cohort. So for all employed persons of all cohorts in the NEPS. Yeah, as I said, I want to finalize my presentation with some concluding words and recommendations on measuring skill mismatches in general. And these are, to my opinion, the 5 most important points to consider when measuring skill mismatches. First of all, it's important to measuring objective and subjective skill mismatches. As we have seen, there's a huge difference between subjective perceptions and self-reports and objective skill mismatches. What is also important is to cover global and skill-specific domains of skill mismatch, because when covering both dimensions, then you can then you have the opportunity to find answers to analyze different research questions. For example, to focus on only on skill mismatches in ICT competencies. Who is underskilled in ICT competencies and who is not? So it's important to cover both. Another recommendation is to use subjective measures to cover mismatches in skill domains that are not testable by competency tests. Like, for example, as I said, teamwork skills and communication skills, for example. And perhaps probably the most important point is the 4th point, to use differentiated scaling to capture the accent of skill mismatches and to distinguish between underskilling and overskilling. As we have seen in our current or former measure of skill mismatch in the NEPS, we cannot distinguish underskilling and overskilling, and this is a really disadvantage of this measure. And the concluding point is it is also good to measure in the panel design, because then you can address the dynamic character of skill mismatches over the life course. So you because, as I said, the incidence of mismatch can differ from the point in your career, for example. Yes, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Stephan. That was a really interesting presentation. Great to see those initial results. Our first question is from Alexei. So can we unmute Alexei Romanko, please, so he can ask his question?
Hi, Khloe. Hi, Stephan. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I have a very general question regarding the behavioral biases of respondents. So I have a, let's say, personal observation that it's much harder to assess your incompetence, when answering this question. So if you're overskilled guy, you definitely can say that, okay, I'm overskilled for this job. But if you're underskilled, it's much harder, to provide exact evaluation. So my question is, how do you plan, and do you plan at all to account for behavioral biases in responses?
Yes, thank you for your question. This is a really critical point for measuring subjective skill mismatch, because we have biases. We have overconfidence biases, so some people think they are better than they really are, and we see that especially people not tend to assess themselves to be underskilled. So that's a big problem. And it's not so easy to address this problem. We tried it by the formulation of our answer categories. So to also allow a differentiation, so to allow the differentiation between significantly underskilled and somewhat underskilled, because we know from other surveys that if you only give the opportunity to select underskilled matched overskilled, then you become less, or there are less people who assess themselves as underskilled. But if you allow for this differentiation, then some more people assess themselves as somewhat underskilled. But this, I think there's no there's no conclusion, or there's no one size fits all solution for this problem. This is a big problem for all subjective skill mismatch measures.
Thank you very much, Stephan and Alexi, for your question. We've also got one from Catherine. So can we unmute Catherine, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Stephan. I found that really interesting. I have a question around your competencies mismatch measure, which I thought was really interesting. And I just really wondered how you felt that information would feed into policy debates. Specifically, I'm thinking, do your findings suggest that employers should be responsive to the findings of your skill mismatch, thinking around the competencies, or an offer training, for example? Is that really where you think it's heading?
Yes, I think it really interesting results for employers, because as you said, and this is one reason why we want to use so many skill-specific mismatches or mismatch measures, because then we have the information in what skills are lacking, or where are the underskilled, and in which skills are the employees underskilled. And this would be good information for employers, because then you can offer specific training for these skills. For example, if in a company most of your employees is underskilled in ICT skills, it does not make sense to give to offer them a training in another skill or in general skills. So yes, I think this should be, or this could be very interesting for employers to know, which skills are lacking. And what is also interesting, or what we know from literature, is that for employees, it's even more important to know about the subjective feelings of the employees than about the objective skill mismatches. Because we know job turnovers are especially high among those who feel subjectively mismatched, even if they are not objectively mismatched. So especially for employers, this comes with important insights, the subjective results, or the results for the subjective skill mismatches.
Thanks. Thanks, Stephan. So I think we have time for one more question. We will be breaking at 11:10 for 20 minutes, and then to come back to session 2, it is the same Zoom link. So hopefully you can all join us. But I'll just hand over to Sanjeev if you want to quickly ask your question before we head off. Can we unmute Sanjeev, or shall I read it out?
Hi, Khloe. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you now.
Yeah, it's sort of linked to Catherine's question, but I'm going back further. So there's a lot of work being done in skills mismatches, but one thing's clear, there's lots of mismatches, whether it's by industry, region, topic matter, soft skills, etc. But I think we should go back a lot further than, say, Catherine and yourself in that discussion just now, to the schools and college curriculums and the syllabus that they have. Obviously, they have got a long-run tradition on traditional subjects like maths, language, science-based bases, etc. But should we make more of this sort of information that's coming out from many domains, and put pressure on the people who set the curriculum to have more topics and more focus on some of these modules like communication, teamwork, ITC usage, etc. Because the modern world career is very different. So if the children are learning at a young age, and some of them are already very IT proficient, FIFA 21, Xbox, etc., but they don't necessarily convert into the workplace often, I mean, very limited so. But what do you think about forcing policymakers to think about developing children and their skill sets for tomorrow's world? I mean, I say that because I learned cooking at school as well as metalwork. One is definitely useful today, the other not so. Thanks.
Yes, I would. Thank you for the question. I would agree to you, or I want to agree to you. I think it's really important, as we also heard in the former presentation, these skills become even more important. The communication skills, the team working skills, and for example, also a very important skill for today's world of work. What should be addressed in education policy in more detail is learning skills, because the requirements in the labor market are changing in these times. So, and we do not know what skills are really needed for pupils now in schools. So it's important to learn the pupils in the schools such skills like communication, such like learning skills, and make this more, give them more priority in school. And this is the reason why we want to measure the mismatches also in these skills, because we think they are really critical and really important for the long sake in the labor market, or for a long time success in the labor market, to adapt to new technologies, to be able to work in a team, and but I'm not sure how we can better learn these skills, or that's a question for the education policy, how to improve these skills in the schools.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Stephan, and for everyone's engagement with this session. We are out of time now. I think in answer to Ewan's question, a link has just been posted for the full programme. And in terms of making these slides available, I believe they'll be published on the ESCoE website, and the session has been recorded. So they will be available. Thank you all very much for joining us. Sorry, we're a little bit over time. As I said, we've got a 20-minute break now before we start session 2, and you can join us there using the Zoom link. And then the final thank you to all 3 of our presenters. They've been really brilliant presentations and really interesting discussion as well. So thank you all.